For a few decades now, there's been something of a complex systems revolution in the sciences as we've begun to understand the depth of connections and interdependencies within nonlinear systems. This revolution, though, has largely bypassed the field of economics. Why might this be the case, and what are the implications for the economy and, of course, for society? Well, I certainly don't know the answer. My extent of knowledge on complex systems and economics is pretty thin, but luckily I'm joined today by someone who does know a thing or two about complex systems and economics. Professor J. Doyne Farmer is a Director of Complexity Economics at the Institute of New Economic Thinking at the Oxford Martin School. And he believes the path to better understanding the economy requires treating the economy as the complex system that it actually is. Thanks for joining us, Doyne.
Nice to be here.
Doyne, you once said that maybe the culture of economics is the problem itself. Do you have many friends in the economics field?
I do. I have quite a few friends there.
Are they're quite happy with this sort of criticism that you throw that way?
Well, of course, people don't like to be criticized, so I try to do it in a nice way. And you know, I'm very conscious of the fact that I got educated as a physicist, and there's a kind of brainwashing you go through when you're a graduate student. You learn a certain worldview, and in science that means that you acquire a certain approach to what questions you should ask, how you should go about answering the questions, what criteria you should decide whether the answers are good or not. And so I come at it automatically from a different perspective than somebody who was trained as an economist. You know, a lot of my friends who are economists are aware of some of the problems in their own profession and don't necessarily take it badly, but some people do take it badly.
Well, let's try to get to the heart of why you think the economy needs to be treated as a complex system. And we'll kick off by asking you this. You're interested, isn't it, in complexity economics. Why are you interested in complexity? What does it have to do with economics? Can you make that connection for us?
So, you know, a complex system is a system with a lot of interacting parts. It doesn't even have to have a lot. With interacting parts that exhibit phenomena that are emergent in the sense that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, that the system as a whole can do things that the individual parts can't do. I mean, a great example would be your brain. Your brain's built out of lots of little neurons, billions and billions of neurons. And you know, a neuron's just a cell. It's a simple cell. You poke it, electrical currents flow through it, yet we're having this conversation. It's all being driven by our neurons that are doing this remarkable thing we call thought as we sit here and speak. And the economy, similarly, is a complex system. It's composed of individual actors. The individual actors make things, they buy and sell things, and they create all the nice stuff, you know, the house we live in, the clothes, the food. It's all created by the economy. And Adam Smith observed a long time ago, 1776, that it's quite a remarkable thing that these emergent behaviors can create, everybody being more or less selfish, going about what they need for themselves, ends up creating this remarkable phenomenon we call the economy. And so complex systems, when I'm saying we need more of a complex systems approach, we need an approach towards the science that really respects this aspect of the economy and that really builds the economy up out of its constituent parts and lets us model it in a similar way to the way we model things like collections of neurons and many other complex systems in nature.
Well, could you give us a sense then of how our economic models are built for now and how they're so different from how they could be? Well, let's come on to complex systems, but how do we work out our economic models now?
Yeah, so the first thing I have to preface it before even saying that in respect of my economics colleagues and of the problem itself. Economics is really hard. You know, physics by comparison is easy because atoms don't think. So atoms just do something. They follow some fixed set of rules that we learned how to write down, but those rules don't change depending on how the atoms are feeling. People are a lot more complicated than that. They can think, you can set something up, and you can look at how they've behaved in the past, but if you change the situation, they may behave differently in the future because they may think about it and reason a little bit and change the way they're behaving. So economists are hit with a really hard problem. We've got a world of 7 billion people all engaged in economic activity. We've somehow got to capture what they're doing. We have very little data to use to validate the models that we build. And so we somehow have to overcome all these problems. Now, economics traditionally, at least over the last, say, 50 years, the core idea has been rationality. How do we explore, if we assume that people are rational, it might be hard to figure out what a rational person would do, but at least once we define what their goals are, and we assume they want to maximize those goals, they want to do them as best they can, then it's pretty clear cut. And so it allows you to make a fairly clean model. Now, over the last 20 to 30 years, economists have also been showing that actually that doesn't work as well as they'd hoped. People aren't rational. And
give us an example. What do we mean when we say people aren't rational?
Yeah, so in economics, being rational means two things. It means that you have a model of the world that is correct, and it means that you're able to think about everybody else in the world and how they're going to react, because you know what their models are, and you're able to do any calculations you need to sort of figure out how everybody's going to react, and then decide what you should do in order to take all that into account, and to do it in such a way that you maximize your utility, meaning you have a goal, like you want to get rich, and you don't want to take big risks on the way to getting rich. So that's your goal, rich, that's your goal. And now you are able to do all these calculations you need to optimally achieve that goal.
But we don't choose to optimize our goals. We maybe, I don't know, eat junk food would be a good example of being irrational, perhaps? Sure.
So well, of course, it depends on how much pleasure you get from the junk food. I have to be a little careful here. My economist friends don't say I'm misrepresenting them. They can put into your utility function that you really, really like junk food. Mm-hmm. You're willing to, cut your life short a few years because you just love junk food. That can go in there. But they're going to assume that whatever your utility function is, you're going to figure out how to maximize it correctly because you understand everything. Now, economists know that that's not right in their defense. They know that's not right. And they're now working to sort of put things in the model. They typically accomplish this by what they call frictions. So they put in stuff like, you might not have access to the right information about what junk food does to you. You may be ignorant about junk food because the information isn't available. And so they put frictions into the models, and because their idea is still that rationality, at least even if it's constrained, is a way to get across the idea that you can think and you're going to try and achieve those goals. Now, then there's a question of whether the whole setup that you end up with is close enough to the world. I think the real problem is that because you try and build in these rationality assumptions, you try and do it in ways that you can calculate it all with a pencil and paper, that the models end up being pretty simple. And they don't capture the richness of the real world, and hence they don't really fully respect the fact that the economy is a complex system.
So let's come on to that point in just a second about what happens when we create these simplified models. But let me just say to the audience at home, we are looking for your questions to come in. So please put your questions to me and subsequently to Doyne through the comments section on the page you're watching this on. If you scroll underneath the window, you should see a place where you can post comments there. Or you can send them to us using #ThinkDiff on Twitter, and we'll make sure that Doyne gets your thoughts and comments as we go through this conversation. But back to you, Doyne. The problems created by simplified systems. I know you want to talk about shocks in business cycles.
Well, so, I mean, this the problem I'm worried about is most evident in macroeconomics, where the standard way to look at the economy is through some set of representative agents who maximize their utility and reach an equilibrium. And in equilibrium, it means whatever their expectations are about the world, the outcomes will match their expectations. So that assumption gets built into these models. And now, in such a setup, absent outside inputs, shocks, they're called. Think of Zeus hurling lightning bolts down from Mount Olympus. Absent shocks, the world would just settle into an equilibrium where nothing changed. But there are shocks. There are things like wars. There are things like, actually in these models, typically the kind of shocks they have, or that people might get more or less patient. People might change the way they're feeling about risk for some random reason. There might be shocks to prices for some external reason. Yeah. And so the economy responds to those shocks, and people reason about them, and then things readjust, and then another shock hits, and that process just keeps repeating itself, and prices move up and down. And so in the picture I've shown here, the business cycle, we see what's really happening. So we're looking at a property. In this case, these are basically an index of where we are in a business cycle, and you see that we're going up and down. I mean, we have recessions shown in gray there, and we have good times, which are above zero. And so, you have periods where, well, things change a lot. And under the standard explanation in economics, it's just coming from random shocks. And all we can do is respond to those shocks. I don't think that's the way it works. I think the shocks are what we would call endogenous, meaning they're innate to the system itself, that the economy generates those shocks from within, not from the shocks. It generates the cycle from within. And so you get oscillations because, investors have more capital or less capital. Because things like, the economy takes a downturn, that causes less demand, which means companies produce less, which means they lay off employees, which means people have less money to spend, which means there's less demand, which means they have to lay off some more people. So you have a self-reinforcing feedback loop in which we get driven into a recession. Then other factors kick in because in the recession, you have a lot of unemployed people. They're really eager to work. They might be willing to accept lower wages. And so the economy regenerates itself and comes back. But so the kind of explanation I'm making there is more about internal mechanisms to the economy that are driven by feedback loops and nonlinearities in the way the economy behaves.
And I guess the really crucial part is that we don't know when the crash is coming. We know there's going to be a crash because we can see historically that your graph went back to 1967, that there will be a recession at some point, but we can't predict it with any great certainty.
Well, we can't predict things with great certainty, period, now. We can get a little bit of insight with existing models into what's causing these kind of events. And we also have a little bit of guidance to try and stay out of them. I mean, central banks work hard to do things like adjust interest rates, or in the case of the 2008 crisis, there was something called quantitative easing. The US government in particular bought up a lot of assets like bonds and mortgage-backed securities. They bought them up to kind of keep the economy propped up, and with some success. I mean, a lot of people think that recession we have here could have been the Great Depression if they hadn't done that. And but I think we can get more insight into what's causing business cycles with a more complex systems-based approach.
And so what are we doing then to understand the forces that create all of these problems. What do economists do, your economist friends do, to try to understand how we can deal with these crises?
Well, they make models called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. So it's a mouthful. They call them DSGE models. It's maybe a little easier. Mm-hmm. And those are the kind of models I was describing a moment ago. They ask questions like, how would a representative firm look at what's going on? How would a household look at what's going on? And they assume that the central bank will follow a certain set of rules for adjusting interest rates. And they assume that households and firms, the households are employed by the firm. The firm's reasoning about production. They produce the stuff for the household. So they have this kind of stylized model with a representative household, a representative bank, representative firm, and within that framework, they can hit the economy with little shocks, and the economy will, you can think of it like a rocking horse that when the shock hits it, it gets knocked out of equilibrium. It's like you kick the rocking horse, and then it starts to rock. The rocking now corresponds to the way the economy moves under the actions of the agents in the economy. The household and the firm and the bank all start reacting by doing what their equilibrium rationality calculations subject to the frictions that have been imposed in the model. And it slowly rocks back towards equilibrium, but then it gets hit again. So that's how those models work, more or less.
So, and obviously you're not a fan of those models and that rocking horse effect. So how could we do things differently then? Can we move on to this idea of complexity economics and ideas we should embrace instead?
Yeah. So to try and understand social systems, the approach that's emerged in the complex systems approach is there's something called agent-based modeling. That's really a simulation of the social system. And maybe to back up for a minute, in the 20th century, the big driver of scientific progress in the second half of the 20th century was the computer. The digital computer changed everything, because before the digital computer, the only equations we could solve were linear equations. Since about 1970, 60 or 70, scientists started to increasingly get their hands on computers that allow them to just simulate something, even though it might be very nonlinear. There's no way to write down a solution with a pencil and paper. But we can put it on a computer, and the computer can just sort of simulate each step. You build something that's sort of an analog of the real world in the computer, and the computer just simulates everything and takes us through time. So, you're familiar with that with things like a spacecraft. Computers will just simulate the motion of the spacecraft using Newton's laws. Or we can look at how galaxies form, or how molecules interact with each other. We can simulate the way they collide with each other and what they do. And so in the physical sciences, that's been enormously successful. In social sciences, it's not as successful, though it is getting more success. There are some problems like, say, traffic simulation. We can simulate traffic now really well. We can simulate the breakout of epidemics really well. And if an epidemic breaks out, we can even simulate what should we do about it. If we have limited vaccines, who should we give them to get the biggest effect? Which transportation corridors should we shut down? How should we respond? So we can address all those kind of questions now quite well using simulations about the spread of the disease. So if the disease is, say, a virus coming from Africa, we can assume we have some people in Africa and they're intermixing at a certain rate, and they take airplanes to the UK at a certain rate. And if they enter, they're going to enter at Heathrow, and then the virus will spread out from there. And so we can actually simulate the probability of these things happening and the rate at which we expect diseases to spread. My proposal is to do something much more like that for the economy, to simulate the economy at a much finer grained level, where we can simulate individuals. We can take into account the fact that a rich person living in central London might behave very differently than somebody who's on the dole in the Midlands. And young people behave differently than old people. And different kinds of firms behave differently. We could potentially simulate the economy at a much finer grained scale and in a much more accurate way than we do in existing economic models. And that's the approach that I'm pursuing.
Right, I want to come on to an example you've got around the housing market, I think in Washington. We're going to come on to that though in just a minute, if you give us a second please, Doyne, because I want to cut to my colleague Kinga, who's going to tell us about some of the other events that are coming up at the Disruptive Innovation Festival over these 3 weeks. Over to you, Kinga.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you, Doyne. That is a very interesting conversation going on. We have around 200 sessions going on in the 3 weeks of the Disruptive Innovation Festival, and I quickly want to talk you through 3 of them where I am really much looking forward to. Here is a big idea, fueling sharing vehicles with hydrogen. Thomas Schaffer works in this field with B0, who have 50 such vehicles on the streets in Munich. Find out more about his work today at 5 p.m. GMT. Also today at 5, we're going to kick off our circular design case. This is your opportunity to join a circular design journey. You have to pick an everyday object and reflect on its system and where it's been part of. And then you have to think of how can you make this more fit with a circular economy. The winner will have the chance to win the first Circular Design Award and also win an additional £1,000. Next, something completely different. Imagine most of the world's population has been wiped out by a plague, an asteroid, or whatever. How could we rebuild the useful technology that we got so survivors can live comfortable lives? That was the premise of Lewis Dartnell's book, The Knowledge. He will be on the studio this Monday talking about this book. Finally, please do get involved with the conversations. You can use Twitter using the hashtag ThinkDiv, and please let us know what you are enjoying at the Div. Now back to you, Colin.
Thanks very much, Kinga. Yep, loads going on at the Diff, particularly looking forward to that Lewis Dartnell session on Monday. It's a terrific book, and I think it's going to be a great conversation. I think that's 3 o'clock next Monday. Back to Doyne Farmer, and I see a few questions have come in from the audience. I will get round to ask them to Doyne at the appropriate time. But Doyne, you were just started to explain some of the benefits of this agent-based modelling, and I know you've got this example of the housing market. Actually, before we go to the housing example, a question about how you could apply it. Who should be applying agent-based modelling? Is it for sort of top level by governments, or does it work better in sectors, or is there a particular scale that agent-based modelling works best at?
Well, it can work at any scale. I mean, it works best at a very fine grain scale. So ideally you want to, well, and let's distinguish the things we're modeling from who's using it, I guess. So ideally you want to model things at the most fine grain scale that you can. So individuals, households, individual firms, government agencies. Because if you think there's differences between those, then you can try and capture those differences and capture what the heterogeneity of having different people does for you, or different kinds of agents does for you. Now, who should use it? Well, we certainly are hoping that government agencies will start to use some of these models. We have actually presented some of our results in front of the Bank of England. So we've had some interest from the Treasury and from DCLG and some of the other branches of the UK government. But, you know, there's no rule about who can do it. Anybody who's interested we keep our models on a website called GitHub. Anybody who wants can download them and play with them, modify them, do whatever they want. So really anybody can use it. And businesses could potentially use agent-based models. In fact, many businesses do. Businesses like Amazon simulates their distribution system. Southwest Airlines simulates their the deployment of their airline fleet. There are lots of examples of businesses using agent-based models to try and understand better how things work and how they can improve what they do.
Okay, perfect. So let's look at that example of where you have applied the model in Washington. Is it Washington housing market?
Yeah, it's the Washington, D.C. housing market.
I believe we've got a slide you can show as well, a few graphs.
Yeah, so I've got a slide up there if you can see it. Can you
There
see
it
the
is.
slide?
Got it now? Yeah.
All right. So this just compares the output of our model to what actually happened. Let me first of all say a little bit about what the model was.
Can I say, Doyne, I know you're a fan of complexity. There's a lot going on in this slide.
All right. I'll don't panic. I think I can make it make sense. But let me say a little bit about the model first, just so you know what you're looking at. So what we did is we said, well, let's just model what happens when people buy and sell houses. So we model a situation where we had a population. Each household was set up. So we had a representative set of households of different kinds, ranging from poor people to rich people, young people to old people. They, some of them start out owning houses, some of them don't. And let's say you're renting a house, next period, you discover you've just gotten a raise in the simulated world, and we would carefully calibrate the model so the incomes of our agents are matching that of people in Washington, D.C. through time. We got data on that. We matched the age distributions. We tried to match up the population as well as we could. And then, you get a raise and you go, well, gee, maybe I should think about buying a house instead of renting. I mean, you're at the point where you're ready to do that. So we would then simulate the person going to the bank. They would ask the bank whether they could get a mortgage to buy a house. The bank would evaluate them using the criteria that we know banks used, make a decision about whether or not to lend them the money. If they get the loan, then they go out, try and buy a house of the appropriate cost. If they don't get the loan, they can't. And of course, that's affected by things like interest rates. It's affected by how many people are moving in and out of Washington, D.C. So we would simulate the housing market to try and understand how we expected it to respond to things like interest rates or people moving in and out. We didn't try and predict that, but we just tried to predict how the housing market would respond. And in particular, the fact that we had this detailed simulation allowed us to really model the lending process in a great deal of realism.
I'm hearing that you put a lot of work into this, and that's just for simulating the housing market, or the housing market in a particular area. I mean, is that one of the problems of agent-based modeling, is that you need to collect so much data for just simply one sector?
Yeah, you need to collect a lot of data. You need to spend a lot of work writing the programs and debugging them and making everything go. And I think it is certainly one of the things that's held the field back. We are trying to develop libraries, software libraries, that make all that a lot easier. But that's another big job, and that's of course the kind of thing we're always looking for funding for.
But of course, the counter argument is that ultimately agent-based modeling can lead to good news for lots of people, as your graphs are about to tell us.
Yeah, and maybe to respond to that, it's a lot of work. Is it really worth the bother? It's worth keeping in mind that the financial crisis of 2008 cost the U.S. alone, according to an estimate by the Dallas Fed, between $6 and $15 trillion. And that's a lot of money. The annual output of the U.S. is only 15 or 20 trillion dollars. It's a significant fraction of a whole year's GDP. And if you're a Greek or a Spaniard or an Irishman, the outcome for you was really devastating from the crisis. So it's worth putting a lot of work into getting these things right. So I'm not daunted by the fact it's a lot of work. I just think we ought to invest more resources to do it.
Understood. Yeah. All right. Let's see the results of your research then.
Yeah. So in the first panel on the upper left, I show a comparison of a housing market index shown as a dashed line and compared to the output of our model. So what you see is a housing market index that kind of tells you where houses are relative to some reference point, where house prices are. So we start out in 1997 with house prices just by definition at 1. And then we climb up till in 2006, we get to a number that's almost 3. And we come back down. So that almost 3 number means that housing prices went up by a factor of 3. So if a house cost $200,000 in 1997, the same house was costing $600,000 in 2006, and then it came back down to the order of $400,000 in 2010. So they're big swings. Now, of course, if you live in London, you're pretty familiar with this kind of stuff if you've been in London over the last 20 years, because housing prices have soared there. And the concern is that what goes up can come down, as we see there, where we see, a 40% drop in housing prices in Washington, D.C. between 2006 and 2010.
And that's still in the upper left graph.
That's still the upper left graph.
Yeah.
Now, just for reference, we could also predict other things, like one of the things that happened through time is the number of units that were being sold changed. As post-housing crisis, you can see on the next plot to the right that the dashed line showing the number of units sold by 2010, a lot less houses were being sold than had been sold earlier, because the market got very quiet because people couldn't sell their houses anymore. Or another revealing statistic is the number of days on market. During the boom period, during the normal times at the beginning, houses spent quite a lot of time on the market. The typical house spent 100 to 150 days on the market. During the peak of the bubble, houses were only spending, a month or less on the market. And then once the bubble popped and the prices came back down, houses spent a lot of time on the market again.
So this is, sorry to interrupt, this is on the top right graph, the flat line in the center is telling us that houses were only on the market for, I don't know, whether that would be 20 days or something along the lines. And then you have these severe oscillations, but essentially houses stayed on the market a lot longer, both before and after that crash. Yeah,
the oscillations aren't probably as important. That's our model, not being very steady, to be honest. That's not a great thing about the model. You can see that the reality was varying more smoothly than that. What the model did capture was the basic fact that initially houses spent a lot of time on the market. In the peak of the bubble, they weren't spending very long on the market. And then once the bubble popped, they were spending a long time on the market again. Our model basically captured that pretty well.
Okay.
So those are just reality checks of the model. Now, why is the model useful? Well, because then we can do counterfactual experiments. We can say, what if? So, for example, the bottom left plot compares the model to reality, where all we do is we say, suppose the Fed had just held interest rates constant. The U.S. central bank, instead of letting interest rates change, suppose they just kept them flat. How would that have affected things? And what we see is our model says, well, we still get a bubble. It's not as big. It peaks at about 2. It peaks a bit earlier, but we still get a pretty good bubble. But on the other hand, if we had held lending policy constant, things would have been really different, because you have to realize during the bubble, lending got very liberal. There were a lot of policies to provide loans to people that were previously would not have been able to get loans.
The famous subprime loans?
Subprime mortgages. Banks got very eager to lend money. They lent money on more favorable terms. You didn't have to have as good a credit. They would let you pay a smaller fraction down. And they started using more of the kind of loans you use in the UK. In the US, a traditional housing loan like I got when I was, 35 or something, bought a house for the first time, you would get a fixed rate 30-year mortgage. So your mortgage rate would be laid out for you. No matter what the economy did, you knew what you were going to be paying on your house payments. But if you have a typical British type loan, they might do that for you for a couple of years, but then the payment starts to float with interest rates. So it's fine as long as interest rates stay low. But if interest rates go up, your house payments could get a lot higher.
But can I ask a question there about that graph, the bottom two on the left-hand side? Are they telling us with the application of agent-based modeling, the solid line would be the outcome, or are they telling us with a change in interest rate policy, the solid line would be the outcome?
No, the middle bottom and the right bottom plot, what they're saying is that if our agent-based model correctly represents the world, if lending policy had stayed as it was before the crisis, in the olden days, like before 1997, then where, in other words, the typical bank loan in the U.S. was a 30-year fixed rate mortgage with 20% down. So if things had stayed like that, our model predicts that we would not have had a housing bubble, and there would never have been a crisis to start with. There wouldn't have been a crisis at all because we wouldn't have had a housing bubble to trigger the crisis.
So, forgive me if I'm being thick here, Don. You're saying that it's a change in lending policy created the crash.
Yeah, our model is suggesting that it's really the changes in lending policy that happened in the early 2000s that drove the crash. That's the main driver of the crash. Interest rates contributed a little, but the big driver was lending policy, liberal lending by banks, offering too much credit, and offering it in a way that's also unproductive because, in the U.S. they would use these very seductive loans where you didn't have to pay much for a few years, and then you would have a balloon payment you had to make, and you'd have a floating rate mortgage that meant, somebody who didn't have a very good income would buy the house, they'd be fine for a few years, and then they'd get clobbered and have to default.
Okay, I think I'm following along with you. So thanks for that explanation, Don, of what's going on with the housing market there. Questions are coming in from the online audience, and I do want to get round to asking those, and we are running low on time, so we need we need to get to those. So thanks very much for everyone who's putting questions in. Please continue to do so on the page you're watching this on. Okay, so Don, it's kind of changing subject somewhat. Michael Pollins asked this question. Do you think the proliferation of cryptocurrencies, local currencies, and other forms of exchange would make the global economic system more resilient? Or can we add on to that? What might the relation be to agent-based modeling?
Well, we have thought about modeling cryptocurrencies with our agent-based models. I wrote a proposal once to do that. It didn't get funded. But I think the answer to that question is that the devil is in the details. And I am worried about cryptocurrencies because they aren't backed by anything. So, we have to be a little careful with cryptocurrencies, in my opinion. But on the other hand, I think that blockchain, the technology it has for instituting trust and verifying transactions, is potentially an incredibly valuable thing and may lead to a revolution in accounting that will go beyond, double entry book counting from the Middle Ages, so from the Renaissance. So I do think that blockchain is going to be a really valuable technology and is going to have some profound effects. Cryptocurrencies, I'm not quite as enthusiastic about.
Okay, great, thanks for that response. Another question that came in from Ricardo, who refers to an event we had on Monday at the Disruptive Innovation Festival. The economist, he calls himself the undercover economist, Tim Harford. You maybe come across him before, Don.
Yeah,
he described the economy as a social construct, and he suggested not only is the economy for people, but it is people. Does this resonate with the kind of model you're describing?
Yeah, I mean, the economy is people and stuff, right? Stuff plays a role, and we shouldn't underestimate the stuff because, without all the technology that we built, the population of the world would be an infinitesimal fraction of what it is now, because we just wouldn't be able to support as many people as we support. But But so, yeah, the economy is people. We need models of the economy that more represent people. And part of what an agent-based model can do for you is allow you to get away from such a strong dependence on rationality. In this model, our agents are just using simple heuristic rules for buying and selling houses. They do a bit of optimization, actually. They do a calculation of whether they'd be better off renting or buying. So they can do those kind of calculations and say, it makes more sense to buy, or it makes more sense to rent. But they aren't using complicated reasoning that people probably can't do. And so it's a realistic level of reasoning in these models. We're trying to represent more people more as they really are, and with the diversity of people as they really are. And I think, therefore, we are capturing what Tim is referring to of, the economy as a collection of people.
And you've gone into helping to describe, I guess, a little bit more poetically what an economy is. And that was a question I did want to put to you, that the novelist Yuval Noah Harari says that societies need shared stories to be able to move ahead. And George Lakoff, who we take inspiration from, cognitive science, talks about how all abstract thinking is metaphorical. So how do you share the story of complexity economics so that it resonates with people? What's the story you would tell people?
Well, I think we have, science is always operating in the background doing stuff. We're often not even aware of what it's doing, but it provides us as a society with a kind of collective awareness. We're not all aware of everything, but each of us is aware of different things, and each of us can, reason about different things and help come to conclusions about what's going on. So, to take a really simple example, probably most of the viewers by now have used the Google traffic calculator. You want to go from A to B, you plug it in, it tells you the fastest route. If there's a traffic jam, it'll reroute you. We're actually taking into account our effect on ourselves when we reroute that traffic by making use of the computer technologies that we built. I don't like sitting in traffic jams. I'm a happier guy when I'm not doing that. So it's just one of many examples of how the models we make of the world can help us out. The economy, when the economy goes bad, everybody suffers. Now, my father lived through the Great Depression. It was not easy. In the US, we had 25% unemployment. People went hungry. And we don't want that to happen again. We need some guidance. We need good models. We need a robust dialogue and debate about what those models should be. We want those models to be as realistic as they can be to help us think about the world and how we ought to behave to make the world a better place. And I think agent-based models have an important role to play in that story.
I want to just ask one final question then. What are the limitations of using agent-based models?
Well, it's a lot of work. It's you have to have good data to calibrate them well enough that you can believe them. I'd say those are the two main limitations. It's always hard to get a model because we're trying to model people. People can think. A really good model allows you to go into a situation that's quite different from anything you've ever seen and still say something about what's going on. That starts to be really hard because you really ultimately have to have a model for how people are thinking about the world to be able to do that. And to do that really well it's going to be a big challenge for a long time.
I was a little bit cheeky there because there is one final question I want to ask, which is this. Very briefly, why should someone who's maybe an economist or maybe like you, a physicist, study agent-based models?
Well, I just got interested in, I always have wanted to work on the frontiers. I like challenges, hard problems, things that look difficult to do that you might be able to do. I like to predict stuff. And so it just struck me that this was something society really needed that wasn't being done as well as it could be. And so it was where I saw my skills and talents could maybe contribute something.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for contributing to the Disruptive Innovation Festival, Doyne. I've really enjoyed hearing this whistle-stop tour of of agent-based modelling and what it could mean for our economy. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome. Very happy to be here.
Thank you. And thanks very much to everyone online. Thank you for putting in your questions and continuing to watch the Disruptive Innovation Festival. And we've heard it from Down Farmer that complex systems theory has been something that's been adopted by a lot of the sciences down the last few decades. And I'm sure if Down Farmer has anything to do with it, economics will be further embracing it in the future too. Thanks and goodbye for now.